Hello YouTubers and welcome to JK Lenses review of Nikon's holy trinity of f2.8 AFS zoom lenses. Between them, these three AFS lenses are designed to cover the focal length range right from 14mm ultra-wide all the way up to long telephoto at 200mm. In other words, all the focal length range that most photographers are ever likely to need. These three lenses are the 14-24 f2.8 wide-angle zoom, the 24-70 f2.8 standard zoom, and the 70-200 f2.8 telephoto zoom. In the first of these three videos, we have a look at the 14-24 f2.8 wide-angle zoom lens. As usual, this review is in four sections. Firstly, we run down the specification list for this lens, and then have a look at its handling in everyday use. We check out its optical performance, and then see how well it compares against some of the possible alternatives which are available. Just like the latest versions of the other two lenses in this review, this lens has a constant f2.8 aperture across the whole zooming range, is focused by ultrasonic AFS motors, and is a G lens, which means it doesn't have an aperture ring on the lens. It's also internally focusing and has the fashionable nanocrystal coating inside. Also, two of its 14 elements are made of Nikon's extra low dispersion or ED glass. Its ultra-wide 14-24 focal length range is also quite unusual for a zoom lens in the FX format. Before Nikon launched this lens, the only way to get down to focal lengths like 14, 16 or 18mm was to use prime lenses. Although there are now other zoom lenses which will get you into this focal length range, this lens is always going to represent something of a pioneering step by Nikon. These very short focal lengths obviously bring with them very wide angles of view. Compared with the 47-degree angle of view which a 50mm standard lens has on an FX sensor, this lens starts off at 24mm with an 84-degree angle of view, and by 14mm that's increased to 114 degrees. This lens is obviously designed for subjects which are very large, very close, or any combination of the two. If you've never used focal lengths as short as these, it's probably worth having a look at a few test shots just to visualise what these large angle of views actually mean in real life. To do this, we need some subjects which are very large and very close together. So where better than the City of London, with its very large buildings crammed onto a medieval street plan. The subject I've chosen is the magnificent southwestern frontage of the Royal Exchange building. This side of the building is over 20 metres wide, and in the paved area in front of the building it's hard to stand more than about 25 metres away from the building before ending up in the road. Using an ordinary 50mm lens produces a fairly unsatisfactory picture of the building as a whole. The 47-degree angle of view is just about enough to cover the height of the columns, but is nowhere near enough to cover the width of the building. Changing to the 14-24mm zoom lens at its most zoomed in focal length of 24mm improves things considerably. It even makes the sun come out. It's not hard to see why this focal length of 24mm has been very popular with landscape and architectural photographers for many years. All of this side of the Royal Exchange is comfortably in the picture both horizontally and vertically, as well as some of its surroundings. The image of the building is nice and flat. Once again, these are JPEGs straight out of the camera with no post-processing whatsoever. Some of the vertical lines, particularly at the edge of the photograph, are starting to converge, but this is due to the fact that we're standing very close to very large buildings, whose tops are much further away than their bottoms. I've tried to minimise this converging of the verticals effect by getting as high up as I can to take these photographs. I'm actually standing on the bottom of the plinth of a large statue of the Duke of Wellington on his horse, which stands outside the Royal Exchange. If convergence of the verticals is likely to cause you problems, then it can be fixed quite easily nowadays using programs like Photoshop. Alternatively, this convergence can be removed in the camera using a perspective control lens. At 20mm, this large building only occupies the centre of the frame, with plenty of the surrounding area now included. In particular, the seating in front of the building, some of which is only a few metres away from me, is also comfortably included. Convergence of verticals at the edge of the picture is now becoming a bit more prominent, particularly in the office block to the left of the Royal Exchange and the buildings in Cornhill to the right. At 18mm, you really start to see the magic of this lens. It can take very large buildings that are right in front of you and push them way back so that they fit nicely into your picture. Now almost everything in the paved area in front of the building is almost entirely within the picture. Convergence of verticals is now getting quite prominent at the edges of the picture, but it's important to understand that this is because we're including very tall buildings that are very close to us in our picture. This lens is not causing these lines to curve, as it is a rectilinear, not a fisheye lens, despite its appearance. At 16mm, this picture really is becoming a picture of the whole area rather than just the Royal Exchange building. We now have a clear, if rather shady view of Threadneedle Street on the left and Cornhill on the right. At 15mm, this effect is continued even further. We have the Royal Exchange, the area in front, the two streets to either side, and even the Bank of England building on the left-hand side is starting to be included. Where a 50mm lens would struggle to include 6 of the pillars on this side of the Royal Exchange, we now have a picture of the whole building and a full sense of its environment. An effect to watch out for at these extremely wide focal lengths is that it's relatively easy to start including your own feet in the bottom of the picture. The dark shadow you can see at the bottom of this picture isn't actually me, but it's the shadow of the Duke of Wellington's statue whose plinth I'm standing on. The amazing ultra-wide angle view which you get at 14mm really does show the unique abilities of this lens. Despite the height of the buildings and their closeness, there's only slight convergence of verticals at the centre of the picture, and this effect at the edges of the picture is caused by the fact the buildings really are very tall and very close indeed. Despite this, there's almost no curvature to any of the lines, even at the edges of the frame. Getting down to this ultra-wide 14mm focal length without starting to introduce curves into the vertical lines at the sides of the picture really is quite an impressive technical achievement which very few other lenses can match. And, as you'll probably have noticed in all these shots, the depth of field is simply enormous. Everything from the clouds to the paving stones, which at 14mm are just a few feet in front of me, are all perfectly in focus. This is a substantial piece of glass weighing in at around 1 kilogram, and you certainly know when you've got it mounted on your camera. The lens extends about 13 centimetres from the camera and also has a slightly unusual shape. Near the lens mount it's a similar size to many Nikon lenses with a diameter of about 7 centimetres, but towards the front of the lens it swells substantially to about 10 centimetres in order to accommodate the large and curvaceous front element. This element also makes the lens rather front heavy, although when mounted on one of the larger FX format bodies like the D3 or the D4, it's a large but well balanced combination. As you'd expect from one of Nikon's professional lenses, it has a strong metal barrel and high quality rubberized grips on the zoom and focusing rings. Even though this lens has an amazingly short closest focus distance of less than 1 foot, the focusing ring only needs to turn about 90 degrees to take it from there all the way up to infinity. Coupled with an AFS motor, this gives this lens very speedy autofocus response. Add to this the enormous depth of field that comes with these focal lengths, and focusing seems almost instantaneous through the viewfinder. On the side of the lens is Nikon's familiar MA or M switch. When set to the MA position, the lens will be autofocused by the camera, but you can instantly override this by simply holding the focusing ring and turning it. If you turn this switch to M, then the lens is completely manual and you have to focus by turning the focusing ring. Despite the very short throw, the focusing ring is smooth and responsive to use. The lens is completely internally focusing with no external changes as you focus it. Although the zooming ring on this lens is a good size and well made, I find its action rather heavy compared to other Nikon zoom lenses. Although it can be turned perfectly well with 2 fingers, using one fingertip it's quite hard to get the ring to move. All my other Nikon zoom lenses have a slightly lighter action than this, with the obvious exception of the 200-400 f4. As you turn this zoom ring, there's obviously some fairly major pieces of glass being moved around inside the lens. This can clearly be seen if you look at the front of the lens while zooming it. It's not an internally zooming lens. As you turn from 24mm up to 14, the large element at the front of the lens moves outward quite noticeably. This explains why you need a reasonable amount of torque at the zooming ring. In ordinary everyday use, these observations about the zooming ring have no effect whatsoever. However, if you intend to use the lens pointing upwards for a lot of the time, then I think I'd add a small note of caution. As you zoom outwards from 24mm to 14mm, you're very clearly pushing that large front element outwards and upwards. If the lens is pointing upwards while you're zooming, then you're clearly working against gravity as you go from 24 to 14, and gravity is helping you as you go back from 14 to 24. And you can definitely feel this in the action of the zooming ring. My concern might be for people who perhaps use this lens to photograph the night sky, where it's pointing upwards during a long exposure, since the weight of the large front element is kind of encouraging the lens to zoom back from 14 to 24. To be fair, I've set this copy of my lens to an intermediate focal length and left it pointing upwards for a long time, and I've experienced absolutely no zoom creep, as it's called, where the weight of the large front element causes the lens to zoom back towards 24. If you're buying an older second-hand version of this lens which has had quite a lot of use, then I think this is something worth checking. Point the lens vertically upwards and check that the zoom ring can hold the zoom setting in position against the weight of the large front element. In conclusion on handling, this lens is just tremendous fun to use. with its insanely wide angle of view, enormous depth of field, and very short closest focus distance, it helps you to find photographs in places where you wouldn't expect them. The lens has a few peculiarities compared to other Nikon lenses, all as a result of the large front element. Firstly, it has a large push-fit lens cap, which does an excellent job of protecting the front of the lens. Secondly, the lens has a very small built-in lens hood, which is really just a set of 4 petals around the front element. This means that when you're walking around with the lens fitted to a camera body, the front element isn't quite as well protected as with other Nikon lenses, which have a long and deep bayonet lens hood. When walking around with this lens, it's a very good idea to keep the lens cap on all the time, since the middle of the front element is only a few millimetres from the edge of the lens hood, and bumping the end of the lens against something could result in something much more serious than a scratched lens hood. Finally, it's not possible to fit any kind of ordinary screw thread filter to the front of the lens, nor is there a little pocket at the back to fit filters either. When originally released, it meant the lens couldn't be used with filters at all. However, since the lens's release, several companies have come up with cunning systems to allow you to fit large filters over the front of the lens. All 3 of the f2.8 zoom lenses in Nikon's Holy Trinity are designed to provide similar optical quality to prime lenses of the same focal length. Using this as a yardstick, the 14-24 is a lens which certainly doesn't disappoint. As we'll see in this section, its optical performance is every bit as good as the very best prime lenses that Nikon make in this focal length range. The sharpness of this lens is outstanding, every bit as good as the best prime lenses which Nikon make in this range. If you're planning to use this lens with one of Nikon's very high megapixel FX sensors, then you need have absolutely no worries whatsoever. It easily delivers levels of sharpness and detail comparable with the very best prime lenses. The quality of colour and the levels of saturation produced are also excellent. As you can see, the lens produces very punchy images straight out of the camera. Using real-life images as a measure, this lens maintains its outstanding optical quality right to the edge of the FX frame. In extensive use in a wide range of situations, I've never found any evidence of image quality falling off towards the edges. All my previous comments about image quality would be pretty impressive if we were talking about a 50mm standard lens. The amazing thing about this lens is it provides that kind of quality in an ultra-wide angle zoom lens, and also manages to do all of this while maintaining a completely rectilinear FX image. Despite the amazing angles that it's bending light through, particularly at 14mm and at the edges of the frame, it doesn't produce any fisheye curvature of the image. Lines that were straight in the original object appear straight in the final image. Having said that this lens is the match of many prime lenses in this region, it's actually slightly better than some of the older prime lens designs which would struggle to match this impressive list of achievements. For me, this is one of the lens's most attractive features. Despite the amazing gymnastics it's doing with incoming light, it does absolutely everything possible to make sure that the final image looks as close to the original object as possible. If you want a lens to produce curvy fisheye effects, then you need to look elsewhere. If this lens produces curvy fisheye results, it's because the original image was that shape in the first place. The bokeh, or the appearance of the outer focus layers of this lens, are quite hard to comment upon. Even if you focus on a lump of rock right in front of the camera lens, the walls of the quarry, which are hundreds of yards away, are still almost in focus. Pretty much everything in all the photographs in this review is actually in focus. From what I can see of it though, the bokeh of this lens seems very natural. These optical properties mean that this lens gives you the ability to take sharp, accurate photographs with an angle of view much bigger than an ordinary 24 or 28mm wide-angle lens. As we'll see in this section, this opens up a whole range of possibilities for taking photographs in situations where it just wouldn't be possible with other lenses. An obvious example is very tall buildings in crowded city centres. And even at 14mm, this lens makes sure the sides remain straight, which is obviously important in this type of photography. Even when taking this idea to ridiculous limits, such as photographing the 230-metre Heron Tower in London from just across the road, this lens delivers sharp, detailed and accurate photographs. The very sharply converging verticals are nothing to do with the lens, but are caused by our very extreme perspective, i.e. standing ridiculously close to an incredibly tall building. The top of this building is getting on for a sixth of a mile further away than the bottom. The 14mm focal length kind of encourages you to take photographs from these extreme perspectives, which is why you can see varying amounts of converging verticals in the photographs in this review. The effect is most evident when you have tall vertical structures close to the camera and at the edge of the frame, as shown in this ridiculous photograph, which was taken purely to illustrate the effect. If you don't want to see this effect in your photographs, then keep tall vertical things near the edge of the frame at a good distance from the camera. As we mentioned before, if you're determined to stand extremely close to very high buildings and not have any converging verticals, then you can try to get your viewpoint as high as possible, or use one of Nikon's perspective control lenses, or alternatively, you can correct the effect to some extent with programs like Photoshop afterwards. Although the extremely large angle of view is the headline figure for this lens, it's actually the enormous depth of field and extremely short closest focus distance which I find to be the most creative aspect of this lens. It allows you to place objects in the foreground of your landscape photographs whilst keeping them and the background in focus at the same time. To my mind, this increases the sense of depth and involvement in the picture. With smaller objects like this museum exhibit, it allows you to accentuate small details whilst keeping the rest of the object in focus. I also like to use the enormous angle of view and huge depth of field to take photographs that cram in far more than the human eye could take in at one go. This allows you to take photographs where you notice some new detail almost every time you look at the photograph, as in this photograph of a busy Liverpool Street station in London. With its enormous angle of view, which is so far removed from the everyday world of the 50mm lens, I've often heard this lens referred to as something of a niche lens, suitable only for certain specialist photographers. There's an element of truth in this, but what struck me after a few years of owning this lens is just how many niches there are where this lens is absolutely the right tool for the job. To round off this section on performance, I'd like to share with you some of the many niches which I found for this lens, thus illustrating the fact that it actually has a very wide range of uses. As we've already seen, this lens is something of a natural for urban photography. Capturing the spectacle of buildings old and new, often in incredibly cramped situations, could almost be what this lens was designed for. It regularly finds pictures which other lenses simply wouldn't be able to take. The ability of this lens to take photographs in very cramped conditions, or where your viewpoint is extremely limited, has helped me out on a number of occasions. For example, standing in front of the lens at the Portland Bill Lighthouse, there really is no other lens which could have recorded this image. On several occasions in cave systems, the very large angle of view, depth of field and very fast aperture have saved the day. In aquaria, where it's almost impossible to step back any distance from the tank, this lens has been the perfect choice. On a boat in a crowded harbour, where the viewpoint is very close and completely out of one's control, and even when selling your house, where this lens can make the pokiest of rooms look like the wide open prairies. I've also used it when photographing fireworks, where one can't be totally certain exactly where everything's going to go. The 14mm focal length means that you're almost certain to catch everything and then cut out exactly what you want on the computer afterwards. And being a wide-angle lens, it's an obvious choice for landscape photography. The large depth of field allows you to place objects in the foreground as well, and the ability to zoom back to 14mm means that you're almost never caught out when it comes to cramming everything into the photograph. The perspectives which these focal lengths encourage you to take up really do help to produce photographs with a sense of the great outdoors. Another area where this lens excels is in museums, where exhibits can be large and are nearly always crammed close together. A good example is the UK's National Railway Museum, which is basically a large shed crammed with hundreds of trains. The exhibits are very large and there's very little room between them. While other photographers with 24 and 28mm lenses are cursing their surroundings, this lens with its enormous angle of view, huge depth of field and fast aperture is producing usable images. Even this ridiculous contraption, which is 15 feet tall and 93 feet long, can be accommodated in the FX frame. And when combined with the high ASO capability of modern DSLR bodies, it can capture a sense of the cramped and poorly lit environment of this steam locomotive's cab. This outdoor exhibit, which had attracted many thousands of visitors, provided another example of where the 14-24 is substantially more useful than an ordinary 24mm wide-angle lens. Set to 20mm and held above my head, it provides a sense of the exhibits, almost literally surrounded by a sea of spectators. Joining in with the scrum, many photographers were finding that with an ordinary 24mm wide-angle lens, it was practically impossible to get an unobstructed photograph of one of the locomotives. Even with a 24mm lens, you need to stand a fair way back to get the full length of a locomotive in. Given the density of the crowds, this was pretty much impossible without one or two people wandering into your picture. On a couple of occasions, I even wondered if a small scuffle was going to break out between frustrated photographers. Once again, the massively increased angle of view of the 14mm lens compared to a 24 came to the rescue. By kneeling just a few feet from one of the buffers, it was actually possible to get the entire locomotive in, and the gap between me and the locomotive was so small that most people walked round behind me. And as you can see, the resulting picture has the crowd as a background, rather than as an obstruction in front of the locomotive. My last example of the 14-24 lens saving the day comes from the 2014 Tour de France. The first stage was unusually set in North Yorkshire and was scheduled to travel through my local high street. Due to my poor organisation for this once-in-a-lifetime event, about 15 minutes before the riders were due to arrive, I found myself packed into a crowd of people behind a high stone wall about 15 feet above road level. Expecting to be in a more favourable position for photographing cyclists, I'd brought with me my trusty 70-200 f2.8 zoom lens. However, with 4 or 5 rows of people packed tightly in front of me and needing to point the camera downwards in order to see the cyclists, this lens proved to be no use at all on this occasion. Almost by chance, I happened to have the 14-24 in my bag, and the photographs that you can see were all taken by setting it to a fairly wide angle setting, holding it high up above my head and pointing it downwards. It's obviously very difficult to be sure the camera's pointing in exactly the right direction when doing this kind of gymnastics, and so rather like the fireworks example earlier, setting this lens to 18mm meant I could be fairly sure of not missing the vital 45 seconds when the tour's peloton swept by. These resulting images obviously required a great deal of straightening and cropping, but it's meant that I do actually have some images of this unique event, rather than the day being a complete disaster. The unbelievable level of crowd support, the peloton, the Jens Voigt breakaway, and the pageantry of the team cars have all been captured in the safety net of the 14-24 lens. In an attempt to give this review some sense of balance, it's probably worth having a quick look at portraiture, which is an area of photography for which this lens is not particularly well suited. Many of the optical qualities which we've talked about in this section are not really suited to producing flattering portraits. If you're after the kinds of angles of view and depths of field of classical portrait photography, then this lens is definitely not the right one to choose. However, it's also the case that some people do make very good use of these focal lengths for portrait photography. An excellent example is the wedding photographer Jean Ho, who's made something of a trademark of using these extremely wide focal lengths in this particular branch of portraiture. If you want to take photographs of people and include their environment around them, then this lens can certainly be used effectively, such as this example of these glass blowers in their crowded workshop. I really could go on listing the situations where this lens does an excellent job, but I think you probably get the idea. Although the 14-24 is a fantastic lens, it's very big, very heavy and very expensive. So in this section we look at some smaller, lighter and in most cases cheaper alternatives. Firstly, here's the usual test of lining this zoom lens up against the prime lenses which it hopes to replace. Before the 14-24 zoom lens was introduced, the only real way of getting to 14mm was the 14mm f2.8 AFD lens. In its day, this would have been the professional workhorse lens for those shooting at 14mm, and so optical quality is very good indeed. As it doesn't need to zoom, it's smaller and lighter than the 14-24, although oddly, still costs about the same amount of money. Although this lens once set the standard for optical quality at 14mm, the modern technology of the 14-24 has really raised the bar in this area. Consequently, although the 14mm is an excellent lens, the 14-24 does have better optical quality. In terms of qualities like sharpness and performance in the corners, the modern nano-coated 14-24 noticeably outperforms the elderly design of the 14mm f2.8. The bottom line then with the 14mm f2.8 is that it will save you some size and some weight, but it won't actually save you any money, and it will return slightly lower optical quality than the 14-24 zoom lens. Whilst we're passing this focal length, a lens which isn't shown in the picture is the 16mm f2.8 fisheye lens. Although at a similar focal length, this is in fact a very different kind of animal. A fisheye lens attempts to cram a complete 180-degree angle of view onto the frame, and does this by creating large amounts of distortion with many straight lines ending up as curves. Although it falls in this focal length range, it's not really comparable with the 14-24 rectilinear lens. As we've mentioned before, if you're after the sometimes striking distortion of a fisheye lens, then the 14-24 is not the lens for you, and the 16mm may be worth looking at. Returning to our lineup on the screen, the 18mm f2.8 AFD lens has never really made any sense at all to me. Although built to a pro standard in its day, the optical quality is substantially lower than the 14-24. In terms of important things like sharpness and performance right across the frame, it really can't compare with the 14-24. All of this may be academic though, as Nikon no longer make this lens, and it's also extremely hard to find second hand. Somewhere near the middle of the 14-24 range sits the tiny 20mm f2.8 AFD lens, which is probably the first one in our lineup to give the 14-24 any kind of serious competition. It wins massively in terms of size, weight and cost. It's a tiny little lens, as you can see from the picture, and is very, very easy to tuck into a bag and completely forget about until you suddenly need a very wide lens. It also costs around a third of what the 14-24 retails for. It's also been an AFD design of Nikon's for many years, and so there are some good second-hand ones which can be picked up even more cheaply. The optical quality is excellent, and at 20mm it can match anything which the 14-24 can do. The only possible chink in its armour is its performance at f2.8. Here the 14-24 is slightly better, but by f4 you're probably not going to notice any difference. If you just wanted to put a toe into the world of the ultra-wide without going to all the expense of the 14-24, then the 20mm is absolutely perfect. However, in terms of this lens as an alternative to the 14-24, don't forget there's a huge difference in angle of view between 20mm focal length and 14. If your subjects really do need the angles of view that come with a 14, 15 or 16mm focal length, then the 20mm simply isn't going to do it. You simply won't be able to fit your subjects into the frame, so don't say I didn't warn you. The next lens to discuss in our logical sequence of alternatives is the legendary 24mm f2.8. This is a superb little Nikon prime lens, much smaller and much lighter than the 14-24, and costing only about a quarter of its price new. It's a very long-standing Nikon manual, AF and AFD lens, and so there are all kinds of options second-hand. Although it always strikes me that even old manual focus versions of this lens never seem to be much cheaper than the current AFD version. I always take this to be a mark of the quality of the basic lens itself. With its simple, high-quality design, it is noticeably better than the 14-24 at the 24mm focal length. At the narrow end of the 14-24mm range, this lens is very definitely an alternative to the 14-24. It's smaller, cheaper and better. However, and you know what I'm going to say, it obviously can't zoom back any further than 24mm. In practical terms, that probably means that about 3/4 of the photographs shown in this review couldn't be taken with this lens. If you only need a wide lens rather than an ultra-wide lens, then this lens could be the absolutely perfect solution, far better than the 14-24 for you. You'll just need to be sure that you're never going to need to go any wider than 24. Finally, if you're really determined to spend a great deal of money, then Nikon have the 24mm f1.4 AFS lens. Nikon have always supplied a 24 or 28mm super-fast lens, and this is the latest incarnation. It's about the same size as the 14-24 and actually costs slightly more. Optical quality is obviously superb, just edging out the 14-24 at this focal length. If you're wondering why anybody would pay this kind of money for a 14-24 with all its focal lengths except 24 missing, then the answer comes in the f1.4 aperture. If you regularly need to shoot in extremely low light, then this lens obviously has an advantage. In fact, the f1.4 lets in 4 times as much light as the f2.8. Although the excellent performance at high ISO of modern FX sensors makes me less convinced by this argument than I would have been, say, 10 years ago. In addition, though, the f1.4 brings a fairly unique selling point to this lens. Almost uniquely for lenses in this focal length, it starts to be able to isolate subjects from their background, something which all the lenses in this review will struggle to do as a result of their smaller maximum aperture. As always, a very good strategy is to look at buying older versions of these lenses second-hand, where there is a mixture of good and bad news. The 20 and the 24 have been excellent Nikon prime lenses even back in the day of manual focus, which may actually be a perfectly good option if you're photographing things like buildings and stately homes. The 14-24 AFS lens itself is a brand new design by Nikon. There is no earlier AFD version on which to save some money. And interestingly, if you look at buying the 14-24 second-hand, they're actually very hard to find, with only a few ever appearing on the second-hand market at any one time. I'm pretty sure this is because those photographers who have them have no intention of parting with them. In addition, there are a handful of zoom lenses by Nikon in similar territory to the 14-24, although there's no direct alternative to it, particularly at the very wide end, where it remains quite a unique lens. The closest alternative is probably the 16-35 f4 VR lens. This is probably the closest thing to an alternative to the 14-24, as it gets out to 16mm, albeit at f4, and at about 2/3 of the price. It also offers a very high standard of optical quality, very much on a par with the 14-24. If you don't need the super wide 14mm focal length, then this lens is a very definite alternative. The 17-35 f2.8 AFS lens also offers optical quality very similar to that of the 14-24. However, it does this at almost the same price. In one sense, it's effectively a slightly longer version of the 14-24 lens. Next in line is the 18-35 f3.5 to 4.5 lens, costing well under half of the 14-24's price. The lack of f2.8 aperture is probably less of an issue in these focal lengths than it would be for things like telephoto lenses. The AFS version of this lens is very much cheaper than the 14-24 and offers very good optical performance indeed. Although given that it only goes out to 18mm, it's not really a direct alternative to the 14-24. The AFD version of this lens can be had for even less money, but it does offer considerably lower optical performance, particularly in the corners. I'd look very closely at the images produced by one of these lenses before buying one second hand. Finally, there's the predecessor to the 17-35 lens, the 20-35 f2.8 AFD lens. Although getting a little bit long in the tooth these days, these lenses were always built to a very high standard mechanically and can be picked up second hand at very reasonable prices. It doesn't have the poise and control of the 14-24, but if kept away from tricky lighting conditions, can deliver excellent results. Clearly, none of these four lenses is a direct replacement for the 14-24, but if you decide you only need to go out to 16, 17 or 18mm, then you may find that one of these suits your needs better. Thanks for sticking with it right through to the end of the video. I think by now I've told you everything I know about the 14-24 f2.8 lens. As always, deciding whether this lens is the right one for you, I think comes down to three basic questions. Firstly, what type of subject do you intend to photograph with this lens? This question basically becomes, exactly how wide do you need your lenses to go? If all you want is something that's substantially wider than the standard 50mm lens, then a 24mm focal length may be all you need. In which case a 24mm prime lens would be a very good starting point, from which you could extend in the future if it proved not to be wide enough. If you've used ordinary wide-angle lenses in the past, and find that your subject is still too big or too close for them, then perhaps you do need to enter the 14-24 ultra-wide world, in which case the 20mm prime lens would be a very good starting point. If you really do need the enormous angular view of the 14mm focal length, then the 14-24 zoom lens is probably your best bet, as it outperforms the 14mm prime lens quite significantly. It's quite important to get the answer to this first question right. If you buy a lens which is much wider than you need, then you'll almost certainly end up having spent a great deal more money than you needed to. As we've seen in the section on alternatives, every millimetre of focal length that you try to descend from 18mm gets increasingly expensive. Similarly, if you buy a lens which isn't wide enough, then you'll end up with your subjects not fitting in. If you're finding these wide-angle focal lengths difficult to visualise, there's a helpful lens simulator on the Nikon website, underneath the Products tab in the section for Nikon lenses. Having decided how wide you need to go, the second question is, how predictable is your subject? If you normally have a high level of control over the distance between you and your subject, then a prime lens is probably the best way forward. However, if the distance between you and your subject is likely to change, and you don't have much control over it, then a zoom lens is likely to be much more successful. So, for example, if you're photographing a large stately home in its own huge area of parkland, then the building isn't likely to move very much, and you can obviously place the camera anywhere up the drive that you like. For these kinds of subjects, then a prime lens is obviously the way to go, and money spent on a zoom lens is probably wasted. Conversely, if you're photographing things that move around outside of your control, or you have very little control over where you're able to stand, then a zoom lens is probably the best idea. So, for example, using a wide-angle lens in a crowd, or in street photography, is where a zoom lens will definitely be worth its money. Having given some thought to these first two questions, the final issue is how often are you likely to be shooting in these focal lengths, as this will determine how much money it's worth devoting to this purchase. If the majority of your photography lies outside this region, and you're only going to be taking these wide-angle shots very occasionally, then I'd strongly recommend looking at the 24 or the 20mm prime lenses, taking the second-hand option if necessary. They'll both give excellent results and don't take up too much space or money. If you're going to be shooting around these wavelengths quite regularly, then it may be worth the expense of something like the 16-35 or the 17-35 zoom lenses. They both deliver excellent optical quality and will both give you the flexibility to explore the creative possibilities of this focal length range. Finally, if you're certain that you need the very widest focal lengths that we've talked about, and you're going to be doing this kind of photography a lot, then going all out for the 14-24 zoom lens may be the way forward. And finally, don't be afraid to explore AFD or even manual focus versions of these lenses where they're available. In many cases, you'll be getting almost identical optical performance for a great deal less money. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found some of it useful. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to type them in the box below. I'm steadily uploading videos on a wide range of Nikon lenses, so please subscribe. And finally, thanks for watching.